Few names in the history of crime have captivated the public's imagination as much as Jack the Ripper. In the late 1800s, this enigmatic figure terrorized London's Whitechapel district, brutally murdering at least 5 women and leaving a trail of fear and unanswered questions in his wake. The identity of this infamous serial killer remains a mystery more than a century later, with countless theories and conjectures proposed by amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike. Nonetheless, the Ripper's shadow looms large over the world of true crime, as a symbol of humanity's darkest impulses and our enduring fascination with unsolved mysteries. The Jack the Ripper case is unique in the history of crime and law enforcement, representing a watershed moment in how society grapples with the concept of evil and efforts to bring such villains to justice. The gruesome nature of the murders, the taunting letters sent to the police and media, and the authorities' inability to apprehend the killer all contributed to an atmosphere of fear and fascination that still exists today. In this episode, we'll delve into the murky world of Victorian London, sifting through evidence and delving into some of the most compelling theories in an attempt to finally solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper. Our journey will take us from the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel to Victorian England's halls of power, as we investigate the various suspects and scenarios that have been proposed over the years. We will face the challenges and limitations of 19th century forensic science, as well as the impact of sensationalist media coverage on the investigation along the way. We will also consider the Ripper case's cultural legacy, examining how it has shaped our understanding of crime and punishment, as well as the lessons that can be drawn from this bloody chapter in history. So come along with us as we embark on a thrilling and terrifying journey to uncover the truth about one of history's most notorious killers. We hope to shed new light on Jack the Ripper's identity through meticulous research and analysis, providing some measure of closure to the victims and their descendants. We may discover that the search for Jack the Ripper reveals as much about ourselves as it does about the man behind the legend, as we explore the dark corners of the human psyche and the depths of our collective obsession with unsolved crimes. To comprehend the events of 1888, it is necessary to first paint a picture of the time and place where the Ripper's heinous crimes occurred. In England, the late 19th century saw rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social change. London, the beating heart of the British Empire, was a frantic metropolis teeming with people from all walks of life. However, the city's rapid growth resulted in overcrowding, which was most visible in the East End district of Whitechapel. Whitechapel was a densely populated area with extreme poverty, overcrowding, and filthy living conditions. A diverse population of immigrants, transient workers, and impoverished residents lived in the district. Many of the women who lived there turned to prostitution for a living, leaving them vulnerable to violence and exploitation. The Ripper began his reign of terror in this dark and desperate environment, targeting some of society's most marginalized members. At least 5 women were brutally murdered in the Whitechapel area between August and November 1888. These victims, known as the Canonical Five, are widely thought to have been murdered by the same person who became known as Jack the Ripper. The first victim was Marian Nichols. Marian Nichols, often known as Polly, was a 43-year-old prostitute who struggled with alcohol addiction. Estranged from her husband and children, she lived a transient life, moving from one lodging house to another.
On August 31, 1888, her body was discovered in Bucks Row, Whitechapel.
Her throat had been slashed twice, and her abdomen had several deep. Nichols' murder marked the beginning of the infamous killing spree attributed to Jack the Ripper. Less than 2 weeks after the first murder, Annie Chapman's turn came. Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old mother of 3, turned to prostitution following the death of her husband and a subsequent battle with alcoholism.
On September 8, 1888, her body was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street.
Like Nichols, her throat had been cut, and her abdomen had been partially disemboweled. Notably, her uterus had been removed by the assailant, indicating that the killer may have had some anatomical knowledge or medical skill. In the last days of September, the Ripper found his next two victims. The first one was Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant, was a 44-year-old prostitute who had a history of abusive relationships and struggled with alcoholism.
Her body was discovered on September 30th, 1888, in Dutfield's yard, off Burner Street.
Unlike the previous victims, Stride's throat had been slashed, but her body showed no signs of mutilation. This led some to speculate that the killer had been interrupted before completing his gruesome work. A few hours after Stride, the body of Catherine Eddowes was found as well. Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old mother of three, had a tumultuous life marked by poverty, alcoholism, and an unstable relationship with her common-law husband. Just hours after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride's body, Eddowes' mutilated remains were found in Mitre Square. Her throat had been slashed, her abdomen had been opened, and her kidney and a portion of her uterus had been removed. The close proximity of Eddowes' murder to Stride's fueled speculation that the killer had sought a second victim to satisfy his sadistic desires. The last victim of the Ripper and the youngest one were murdered after a month of silence. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the canonical victims at 25 years old, was an Irish-born prostitute who lived in a small rented room in Miller's Court, off Dorset Street.
On November 9, 1888, her brutally mutilated body was discovered inside her room.
Her throat had been severed, her body had been horrifically dismembered, her heart had been removed, and her organs were strewn about the room. Kelly's murder was the most gruesome and brutal of the five attributed to Jack the Ripper, marking a horrifying end to the series of killings. The brutality of the murders, as well as the apparent skill with which they were carried out, quickly drew the attention of the media. Newspapers competed to publish the most gruesome details, frequently embellishing facts or printing gruesome illustrations in order to sell more copies. This sensationalist coverage created a climate of fear and fascination in London and elsewhere. The killer's moniker, Jack the Ripper, was derived from a letter sent to the Central News Agency in September 1888, which was allegedly written by the murderer himself. Though the name was later proven to be a hoax, it stuck and became synonymous with the terrifying figure behind the killings. The Jack the Ripper case also marked the beginning of a new era in crime reporting, as the public's appetite for gruesome details grew insatiable. This media frenzy fueled speculation about the identity of the killer, with numerous theories and suspects proposed. As armchair detectives and professional investigators alike attempted to solve the mystery, the case became a source of morbid fascination and public debate. Mary Jane Kelly is widely regarded as the Ripper's final victim. But in the same area of London, in the following months after November 1888, several more deaths of women occurred. Those cases were suspected to be related to Jack the Ripper, but not with certainty.
On December 20th, 1888, the strangled body of 26-year-old Rose Milett was discovered in Clark's Yard, High Street, Poplar.
There was no sign of a struggle, and the police assumed she had either hanged herself with her collar while drunk or committed suicide. Milett had been strangled, according to faint markings left by a cord on one side of her neck. The jury returned a murder verdict during the inquest into Milett's death.
Few months later, Alice Mackenzie was murdered in Castle Alley, Whitechapel, shortly after midnight on July 17, 1889.
She'd been stabbed twice in the neck, and her left carotid artery had been severed. Her body had several minor bruises and cuts, as well as a 7-inch long superficial wound extending from her left breast to her navel. One of the pathologists examining the bodies of the Ripper's victims, Thomas Bond, believed it was a Jack the Ripper murder. His colleague, George Bagster Phillips, unlike him, who had also examined the bodies of 3 previous victims, disagreed.
On September 10, 1889, decomposing headless and legless torso of an unidentified woman aged 30 to 40 discovered beneath a railway arch in Whitechapel's Pinchin Street.
Bruising on the victim's back and arm suggested she had been severely beaten shortly before her death. The victim's abdomen was also severely mutilated, but her genitals were unharmed. She appeared to have been murdered about a day before her torso was discovered. The dismembered body parts are thought to have been transported to the railway arch and hidden beneath an old chemise.
More than a year later, on February 13, 1891, Frances Coles was discovered with her throat slashed beneath a railway arch in Whitechapel.
Her throat had been severed, but her body had not been mutilated, leading some to believe Thompson had agitated her assailant. Coles was still alive, but she died before medical assistance could arrive. James Thomas Sadler, a 53-year-old stoker, had previously been seen drinking with Coles, 96, and the two are known to have argued about 3 hours before her death. Sadler was apprehended and charged with her murder.
He was briefly suspected of being the Ripper, but was later discharged from court on March 3, 1891, due to a lack of evidence.
Did you know that Historical Cosmos has an online presence beyond the podcast? Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to stay updated with fascinating historical content. For even more in-depth historical mysteries and articles, visit our website at historicalcosmos.com. There you'll find a treasure trove of captivating articles that delve into the mysteries of history. Join us on social media and explore our website at historicalcosmos.com. But since those days, many years have passed, in which a number of suspects' names have come and gone as the one who became known as the brutal killer who operated in London. The first person who has the potential to be Jack the Ripper is Montague John Druitt.
Montague committed suicide on December 31, 1888.
His body was discovered in the River Thames, about a month after the last canonical murder attributed to Jack the Ripper. His death was determined to be a suicide by drowning. Some have speculated that Druitt's suicide was significant because the Ripper killings appeared to come to an end abruptly after his death. This matter does not prove his mysterious identity, but it is only the beginning. According to reports, Druitt's family suspected him of being involved in the Whitechapel murders. Druitt's own family had strong reasons to suspect him of the crimes, according to a memoir written by Chief Inspector John George Littlechild, a senior officer in the Metropolitan Police. Exactly at the same time, Montague was fired from his teaching position at a boys' school in Blackheath shortly before committing suicide. Although the reasons for his dismissal are unknown, some speculate that it may have been related to his possible involvement in the Jack the Ripper case. Druitt was 31 years old when the murders occurred, which roughly corresponds to the age range of the suspects described by some witnesses. Furthermore, his upper-middle-class upbringing and profession as a barrister may have provided him with the means to avoid detection. It is important to note, however, that there is no direct evidence linking Druitt to the Ripper murders, and his connection to the case is primarily based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. Many modern-day researchers regard him as an unlikely suspect, but his name is inextricably linked to the enduring mystery of Jack the Ripper's true identity. Aaron Kosminski has been a prominent suspect in the Jack the Ripper case for several reasons, including his background, mental health issues, and possible connections to the Whitechapel area. Here are some key points that have led people to suspect Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant who lived in the Whitechapel district during the time of the murders. His background and proximity to the crime scenes make him a potential suspect, but more is required to substantiate this suspicion. Some reports suggest that Kosminski worked as a barber, which might have given him access to sharp instruments like razors, similar to the ones used in the Ripper murders. If it is not enough, and I guess it's not, there is more. Kosminski suffered from severe mental health issues and was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was known to have violent tendencies and was eventually committed to a mental asylum in 1891. His mental instability and history of violence led some to believe that he could have been capable of committing the brutal and seemingly irrational crimes attributed to Jack the Ripper. But wait, because there is one more detail to note. There have been some claims that Kosminski was identified as the killer by an eyewitness. According to a report written by Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnaghten, a witness allegedly saw the killer but refused to testify against him due to their shared Jewish faith. However, the credibility of this claim is disputed, and there is no definitive evidence to support this identification. The matter starts to get complicated when more suspects are added to our list. One of them is Francis Tumblety. Francis Tumblety, an American-born self-proclaimed doctor, has been considered a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case for a number of reasons, including his criminal history, potential medical expertise, and presence in London at the time of the murders. Here are some key points that have contributed to Tumblety's suspicions. Francis Tumblety had a lengthy criminal record, including arrests for pickpocketing, fraud, and assault. His criminal history, combined with a reputation for being a flamboyant and untrustworthy character, has led some to believe he was involved in the heinous murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. Second, despite his lack of formal medical training, Tumblety's claim to be a physician suggests that he may have had some anatomical knowledge or surgical skill. The gruesome nature of the Jack the Ripper murders, particularly the mutilation and removal of organs from some victims, has led many to speculate that the killer was a doctor. Tumblety's ostensible medical expertise, while likely exaggerated, adds to the suspicions that surround him. There is evidence that Francis Tumblety was in London at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. Tumblety was arrested in London in the fall of 1888 on an unrelated charge of gross indecency before fleeing to France and, later, the United States. His presence in the city at the time of the murders fueled speculation about his possible involvement in the case. Another person who should be suspected is Walter Sickert. During the time of the Ripper murders, Walter Sickert was a well-known artist in London. His paintings frequently depicted urban scenes and lower-class people, including prostitutes. According to some researchers, his artistic subject matter and interest in London's darker side could indicate a fascination with the Jack the Ripper case or even a connection to the crimes. Sickert was said to have a morbid fascination with the Jack the Ripper murders. It's been suggested that he rented a room in Whitechapel, the same neighborhood where the murders took place, and even painted a piece titled Jack the Ripper's Bedroom. However, the veracity of these claims is called into question, and there is no conclusive evidence to back up Sickert's alleged obsession with the case. In the early 2000s, a contentious DNA analysis claimed to link Sickert to one of the Ripper letters. Author Patricia Cornwell, who conducted the analysis as part of her research for a book about the case, claimed that a DNA sample from a letter thought to have been written by Jack the Ripper matched a sample from one of Sickert's letters. However, the Ripper letter's authenticity is being questioned, and the DNA evidence has been widely criticized for its lack of conclusiveness and potential contamination. But Walter Sickert is not our last suspect. Thomas Cutbush had a history of violent behavior. He was arrested and charged in 1891 with stabbing two young women in separate incidents in London's Kennington neighborhood. While these attacks were not identical to the Jack the Ripper murders, they demonstrated Cutbush's capacity for extreme violence, leading some to suspect he was involved in the earlier Whitechapel killings. It was clear that Cutbush had mental health problems, particularly delusions and paranoia. After being arrested for the stabbings, he was committed to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum in 1891. Some researchers believe that his mental instability contributed to the heinous nature of the Ripper murders, and that his confinement in the asylum could explain why the killing stopped after 1888. But this is where things get complicated. Thomas Cutbush had ties to the Whitechapel neighborhood because his uncle worked for the Metropolitan Police at the time of the murders. This family connection to law enforcement may have provided him with information about the investigation as well as the ability to avoid capture. Furthermore, Cutbush lived close to the murder sites, allowing him to carry out the crimes without raising suspicion. The next likely suspect to point out is the most intriguing of all. H. Holmes, real name Herman Webster Mudgett, was a notorious serial killer in the United States during the late 19th century. He confessed to 27 murders, but the true number of victims is thought to be much higher. Holmes' criminal activities included building a murder castle in Chicago, a structure with hidden rooms and passages for torturing and killing his victims. Some believe he was also responsible for the Ripper murders due to the brutality of his crimes and his apparent lack of empathy for his victims. But where's the connection between Jack the Ripper and H. Holmes? Well, there is speculation that Holmes visited London during the Jack the Ripper murders. The author, who claims to be a great-great-grandson of H. Holmes, presents evidence in his book Bloodstains that suggests Holmes was in London at the time of the murders. This theory is based on an alleged Holmes diary, as well as handwriting analysis that compares Holmes' writing to the infamous Ripper letters. Some supporters of the theory point to similarities in the methods of Holmes and the Ripper. Both killers preyed on vulnerable women and used anatomical knowledge in their crimes. However, it is important to note that there are significant differences between the two cases, such as the fact that Holmes appeared to be motivated by a different motive than the Ripper. Moreover, experts have questioned the authenticity of the diary as well as the credibility of the handwriting analysis of H. Holmes' great-grandson. One of the most intriguing and contentious aspects of Jack the Ripper's identity is the theory that he was somehow connected to the royal family. According to this theory, Jack the Ripper was a member of the British royal family or had close ties to it. While there is no hard evidence to back up this claim, supporters of the theory point to a number of circumstantial factors. One argument advanced by supporters of this theory is that Jack the Ripper's anatomical knowledge suggests a medical background, and the royal family had access to top-tier medical education and resources. Furthermore, it is argued that the brutality and savagery of the murders would necessitate a level of impunity that could be associated with someone from a powerful and influential family. But we will never know if it's true. Jack the Ripper may or may not be one of the suspects I mentioned. We'll probably never know. But there's also reasons why the London police didn't know either. Many of the techniques and tools that modern investigators rely on were not yet available or widely used during the Victorian era. Fingerprint analysis was still in its early stages, and DNA profiling was still decades away. Crime scene preservation and evidence collection were not standardized practices, which could lead to contamination and the loss of vital clues. Furthermore, investigators lacked the resources and knowledge needed to effectively analyze the evidence they did collect at the time. For example, while the Ripper's apparent surgical skill led some to speculate that the killer had medical training, experts at the time were unable to determine definitively whether the injuries were inflicted by a skilled hand or simply by someone with rudimentary anatomical knowledge. Another thing to mention is the intense media interest in Jack the Ripper. The case resulted in a proliferation of sensationalist news stories, many of which exaggerated or even fabricated details to sell more copies. This distortion of facts made it difficult for investigators to distinguish between fact and fiction and may have hampered their ability to identify relevant leads. The sensationalist coverage also contributed to the public's spread of fear and panic, making it more difficult for the police to conduct their investigation. False reports and wild speculation fueled a climate of distrust, with many accusing the police of incompetence or even concealing the identity of the murderer. The strained relationship between the public and the authorities is likely to have hampered the flow of potentially useful information. The case's high profile, combined with the public's morbid fascination, resulted in the emergence of numerous hoaxes and false leads. The most famous example is the Dear Boss letter, which was sent to the Central News Agency in September 1888 and purported to be written by the murderer himself. The letter, which gave the murderer the moniker Jack the Ripper, was later discovered to be a hoax by journalists looking for a sensational story. Other hoax letters and alleged confessions poured in, making it difficult for investigators to determine which, if any, were genuine. The prevalence of these hoaxes not only wasted valuable time and resources, but also further confused and obfuscated the facts of the case. We delved into the dark and enigmatic world of Jack the Ripper, one of history's most notorious and mysterious serial killers. We investigated the socioeconomic context of the Whitechapel district at the time of the murders, as well as the disturbing details of the 5 canonical victims. We investigated various theories and key suspects, each with their own intriguing connections to the case. Despite more than a century of investigation and countless theories, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery. The Victorian era's limitations in forensic evidence and investigative techniques, combined with sensationalist media coverage and the prevalence of hoaxes and false leads, have complicated the hunt for the killer's identity. As we come to the end of our journey into the world of Jack the Ripper, we invite our listeners to reflect on the enigmatic figure at the center of this bloody chapter in history. Despite the passage of time and countless theories, the true identity of the killer remains a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human soul. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Historical Cosmos. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to subscribe and leave reviews. Your support helps us bring more captivating historical mysteries to unravel within the vast expanse of the historical cosmos. Stay tuned for future episodes, where we will continue to explore fascinating historical enigmas that shape our understanding of the world.